Hey friends! In this video we are going to paint together these vintage flowers. I'm going to show you all the techniques you can use to paint these vintage flowers in watercolor, but also techniques you can apply to any other watercolor flower composition. My name is Luisa and this is the Lulu Blue Studio. Let's start painting vintage flowers together. We start painting these flowers in watercolor using a little bit of Quinacridone Magenta and a filbert brush in size 8. I take a little bit of this color, very concentrated, so there isn't so much water, but there is a high concentration of pigment, and I start to create the very first two petals. Then I remove part of the pigment in the cup of water, and I keep creating these petals with a very light color value. Some of the petals are actually touching the more concentrated ones, and for this I will allow a little bit of bleeding effect happening between all of the petals. With some more concentrated Quinacridone Magenta, I highlight some of the petals of this very first peony, and I keep optimizing, let's say, the shape of this flower until I'm happy. With a round brush in size 12, I instead start to create the stems and the leaves. I use a little bit of gray ink that is into this jar in dark color, this brown jar, and I started to create these leaves with this color because looking at the reference picture, I noticed that these vintage flowers actually have very bright petals, like we did for this peony in first place, but then the stems and the flowers have quite cold colors, and in order to do so, I achieve this effect by using a little bit of gray ink to create the base of these stems and leaves, and then I add through the wet on wet technique some green, some sap green to blend into this first layer of paint. So the overall effect of vintage for this flower composition is going to be achieved by using quite cold colors and a little bit muddy colors to create the stems and the leaves of these flowers, and by leaving the petals of these flowers very bright. So we're going to create some contrast between the bright colors of the petals of the flowers and the muddy colors of the leaves and the stems. Additionally, we are going to add through the wet on dry technique some layers, especially on the leaves of the flowers, and this is typical of the effect of these vintage flowers, where I saw that both the stems and the leaves have a little bit this characteristic of being more accented through layers, and we are going to achieve this towards the end of this painting session with a round brush in size 6 and adding a few layers on leaves and stems. But for now, we keep creating the petals of our flowers, and in particular, we play with a little bit of Quinacridone Magenta and its color values to create the external petals of this big peony. So the technique I'm using at this point is to use some more concentrated Quinacridone Magenta to create the external petals, and then to remove part of the pigment in the cup of water to create some lighter petals all around the white center. For now the center is kept white, but we are going to add in a second moment some yellow to create the center part of the peony. Through the wet on wet technique, I add some more concentrated Quinacridone Magenta into the wet petals. And then with a round brush in size 6, I start to create the center of the second peony, adding a few brush strokes just in the center with some lemon yellow and yellow ochre. I want these flowers to be quite bright in the center part, and therefore I really use a type of yellow that is cold and very bright. With the same brush and with a mixture of burnt umber and Mars black, I start to create the stem of this second flower. As I noticed from this reference picture, the stem of these peonies have quite a dark color, and therefore I use this mixture. And when you create stems, remember not to create them as straight lines down to the bottom, but remember to give a little bit of flow and movement, creating these stems in sort of S shapes, or anyway with a sort of movement and not just straight lines. So this is what I have done. And then using a round brush in size 12, I've decided to add a few leaves in the lower part under the bottom of this flower. And I've used a little bit of gray ink to create the base of these leaves. And then I'm adding through the wet on wet technique a little bit of Sap Green to give a brighter green touch to these leaves. With just a little bit of Mars Black, I highlight a little bit further the stem of this second peony, because looking at the reference picture, I noticed that the stem of this composition is quite dark. And I also plan to add a little bit more stems to create another peony in the bottom part of this page. If you are enjoying watching this video, please think to subscribe to this channel, because it really helps me to create free content for you to watch on YouTube. Also, if you enjoy painting flowers in watercolor, you can download for free the Beginner's Guide to Watercolor Flower Painting, which is an 18-page ebook I wrote for you, where I highlight all my favorite supplies and all the techniques you can learn to use in order to improve your watercolor skills. Download the Beginner's Guide to Watercolor Flower Painting by clicking on the link in the description below. Back to our painting, I'm creating another flower in the bottom part of this composition, and I'm using the same colors and the filbert brush. I have highlighted mainly the external petals of this round flower. And at this point, with a round brush in size 6 and with a little bit of yellow ochre and lemon yellow, I started to create the center of the last peony of this composition. Basically, this peony is going to be the biggest peony and is going to be quite open, so we see the center quite well. And I'm adding now a few brush strokes with the filbert brush in order to create the petals that are all around the yellow center. Some petals are more concentrated and some petals are quite light in color value. And one new perspective that I wanted to share with you painting this last flower is to think that sometimes these flowers don't all fit onto the white page, but they are maybe sometimes a little bit bigger and our eyes just see a part, and you can imagine that a part of the flower is going over the white page. So this is the effect that I'm going to try to achieve for this last peony. And in the meanwhile, I'm adding a few brush strokes of more concentrated Quinacridone Magenta that will blend onto the first layer of the petals. This whole composition of vintage style flowers is quite heavy in amount of flowers that I'm creating and amount of leaves. For this reason, in the moment we are going to add layers, I've decided to add layers only onto the leaves of these flowers and onto the stems. So looking at the reference pictures, these vintage flowers have characteristic lines that sort of highlight the veins of the leaves and of the petals. In this case, since this composition is quite heavy in the amount of flowers I created, I've decided to create these veins only onto the stems and the leaves. And this is what we are going to achieve in a second moment when we are going to add layers onto the leaves. But for now, I keep adding with a round brush in size 12 a few brush strokes that represent leaves. And I'm using mainly some gray ink to start to create the first layer of the leaves. And then I add a few touches of Sap Green to create a little bit more contrasting brush strokes. I really like the contrast between these leaves that are not very concentrated in color and are not super bright, with the petals of these flowers that instead are very bright, and the way that we played with the color values of this Quinacridone Magenta color to create different effects. With the round brush, I take a little bit of burnt umber with the Mars Black and highlight even further the stems of these flowers. Looking at the reference picture, it is really obvious how these vintage flowers have very dark stems, and therefore this is the effect that I'm trying to highlight in this moment. Taking my round brush in size 12, I just added a few more leaves into the center part of this composition, and I allowed some Sap Green to blend onto the ink, the gray ink that I've used to create the first layer. And it is at this point that I've decided to use my round brush in size 6. This is a round brush from Silver Black Velvet, and I'm using a mixture of Quinacridone Purple with green to create the veins of these leaves. I'm using this brush because this brush is the only one I own with the softest bristles, and this allows me to create these brush strokes that are quite light, and no other brush allows me to create these veins with the same effect. Basically, I don't want all these veins to be just straight lines, but I want them to be quite fluffy, quite light, having some brush strokes that are thicker than others, some to be very, very fine. And I love doing this with this round brush in size 6 from Silver Black Velvet. I create a dark mixture of green, mainly using onto the green a little bit of Quinacridone Purple or Quinacridone Magenta, and therefore creating a sort of green that is much darker but also a little bit duller compared to the greens that I've used to create the base of the leaves. And so at this point, with your round brush, whatever brush you have, just have fun and add these brush strokes onto the leaves. If you want, you can also add more brush strokes in this style onto the petals of your flowers. I've just decided not to do this onto the petals because I thought the composition was heavy enough in elements, and I wanted a little bit more contrast between the flowers and the leaves. And at this point, I'm mixing a little bit of transparent orange to the yellow mixture of yellow ochre and lemon yellow to create a few brush strokes into the center part of these flowers that is a little bit darker. I really hope you are enjoying this video, this tutorial, and I also hope that this tutorial is giving you some fresh inspiration for other flower compositions that you can paint on your own. Please let me know if you have painted this watercolor piece of vintage flowers along with me. Thank you for watching. See you with my next video.